Well, one of the remarkable things about American conquest and colonization is the ways in which we have to pause for a little material history here. One of the remarkable things is the ways that the systems used to take Indian land adapted almost perfectly to changing patterns of Indian landholding. And we can think of these as distinct modes of colonial practice. A lot of the discussion in American history about colonialism and America as a colonial or imperial empire is focused around 1898 and the sort of movement offshore. But the fact is, right, as the Americans developed intensive and effective imperial colonial kinds of strategies around Indians, each one had its own cultural logics, right, images of savagery, of containment on reservations, of eventual pacification. Each had its own political analogs, and each had its own strategies. I'm not going to talk about this in great detail, but just to show you a couple of things to get you thinking about this. So we think about the first mode as being kind of a nation-to-nation mode, right? Savagery is in some ways the marker, treaty making is the political analog, and there are clear boundary lines, and the boundary lines happen on a continental basis, right? Continental kind of basis. We're thinking about the largest possible landform, and here, in fact, are the colonies imagining themselves expanding across the largest possible landform. Then we might move to a second mode of kind of regional consolidation, which would be about Indian removal, about regional-sized landholding, and the allowance of state formation. Because if you think back to the thing that I know you've all studied, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, yes, you have. I knew you had, right? It's all about the ways in which a state gets to be a state. What do you have to be a state, not to be a territory? Oh, you have to have 65,000 free white male voters, right? And how do you get that? Well, you actually implement, we could go on and on with these ordinances, but the land ordinance of 1785, which is one of the most important pieces of, my students all fall asleep when I start talking like that. But in fact, what the land ordinance does is parcels up and grids the entire continent, right? It allows us to put people on 160-acre parcels. So if you think moving into a territory and getting that many people there, what do? You have to take your Indians, you have to shrink down their land base. So this is a regional kind of shrinking and consolidation, and you put them on the spaces called reservations. And once you confine them there, then you worry that they're going to get out. So they're worried about outbreak. Will Indians break out? And because they've now been confined and they're no longer contained, will they be mad? Will they come and kill us? Which, in fact, sometimes Indian people do. So now we imagine the ways that segregation and this crunching down allows state formation, and you can see the results of some of this here. Then the final step really comes with the question, what do you do with those reservations? We've got a reservation now, and now we need a finer grained sift. And so what happens is we checkerboard these reservations. We do break them into 160-acre parcels. We disaggregate them, and we desegregate them. Right? And that is made possible through an ideology of pacification. We believe that Indians have been militarily defeated, and therefore we can move in as white neighbors, and they will not kill us because they have been pacified. Right? So we've got this kind of thing going on. Super effective forms of colonialism in the United States. Now, two master ideologies everywhere in the American cultural imagination underpin this highly effective sifting process, which transferred land from Indian people to the United States and then to its citizens. The first was the familiar notion of manifest destiny, that thing which is so contested in the new AP history standards. Right? The idea that God just really, really, really wanted the United States to, take over the whole continent. This was sort of, his will and desire. The second ideology was simply its logical corollary, right, which was that Indian people were destined to vanish. Right? But they weren't being killed, and they were not being driven off their land. No, they just simply disappeared, kind of as if by magic. By a law of nature, claimed Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story in 1828, they seemed destined to a slow but sure extinction. Everywhere at the approach of the white man, they fade away. We hear the rustling of their footsteps like that of the withered leaves of autumn, and they are gone forever. They pass mournfully by us, and they return no more. We had nothing to do with it, right? Just kind of how it happens. Well, we might choose many routes into a discussion of these ideologies, and I don't claim that the choices I'm about to make are the only ones or the best, but you could do worse than to turn to the writer James Fenimore Cooper, author of the 1826 novel Last of the Mohicans, and the painter George Catlin. Both represented the complicated ideological mix that developed in the United States: closeness and distance, affection and distaste, identification and repulsion, conquest and lament. And these men, and men like them, and sometimes women, helped lay down the bedrock upon which much of our subsequent cultural expression rests. So I'm going to pull these two folks out and kind of elevate them and talk about them a little bit, but they are in fact representative of larger wholes. Folks in the classes today, we talk a little bit about this as a kind of method about ways of thinking about these things. Now, Last of the Mohicans was one of the most popular novels of the 19th century, and the book inspired and influenced many other forms of popular culture. The great Hudson River School painter Thomas Cole, for example, painted 3 Last of the Mohicans scenes in 1827, almost immediately after reading the book. Mark Twain made fun of it. Nathaniel Wyeth, among others, painted cover art and illustrations. And it was made into 4 film versions, including the great 1992 version starring Daniel Day-Lewis, Madeline Stowe, Wes Studi, and American Indian movement stalwart Russell Means. Has anyone seen that version, that film? Well, you should. It's awfully good. Tweet that, somebody. Okay, good, thank you. So now, Cooper's story has savage Indians, the evil Magua, and it has good Indians, the noble Uncas and his father Chingachgook, that's Russell Means. It's set in 1757 on the colonial frontier during the French and Indian War. Now, Uncas, Chingachgook, and the super good guy, colonial backwoodsman Hawkeye, that's Daniel Day-Lewis, are attempting to bring to safety the 2 daughters of the British Colonel Monroe. There they are. Now there's a blonde daughter, Alice, who is very much the white product of Monroe's second marriage. And then there is dark Cora, the very quietly in the novel mixed-race daughter of his first wife, a mulatto woman linked to his military service in the Caribbean. We don't have time to do a super close reading of this very, very long and complicated novel, but suffice it to say that the plot is driven structurally by the possibility of romantic union, that is, of marriage and procreation for the future. In Cooper's novel, fragile, frail, womanly Alice is loved by the sturdy British officer Duncan Hayward. And there's a constant play on the possibility that the dark-haired and also sturdy Cora might make a good match for Uncas, right? 2 kind of a cross-race sort of thing going on there. And this would be a very good thing for the Mohicans because it turns out that Chingachgook and Uncas are in fact all that is left of the tribe. They are the last of the Mohicans. And so Uncas needs to get busy creating new little Mohicans, and he needs to do so quickly. But that, my friends, is not to be, for the ideology of the vanishing Indian makes it clear that there is to be no Indian future. And this is about then marriage and procreation, the possibilities of that. How the argument gets made in Cooper's book and Michael Mann's film, however, tells us, I think, about both the enduring quality of these vanishing figures in our cultural imagination and just how flexible such forms can be while conveying the same kind of message. So, for Cooper, this is a little complicated if you don't know this, haven't read this novel and thought about this, but I'm going to try to make it clear, and I think I can. For Cooper, America's future is in the hands of upper-class British people of genteel manners and origins. But for Michael Mann, America's future is in the hands of sturdy, mixed-up, backwoods, lower-class pioneers. Now, Cooper doesn't want to have anything to do with these kinds of people, so at the end of the book, he banishes Hawkeye to the west. Hawkeye is too contaminated by his associations with Indians and with the frontiers, so he has no place in the new America, which will be British and elite. Michael Mann embraces that frontier, but he does not embrace the Indians that go with it. And so in his film, Uncas is dead, killed by Magua. Chingachgook departs westward alone. There will be no more Mohicans. The final scene moves from a scene of possibility to one of non-possibility. That is to say, it begins with a kind of a 3-shot. You can see all 3 of them together here. When the camera actually starts, it's holding, all 3 of them look like they're standing here together, right next to each other, shoulder to shoulder. So it moves from a 3-shot of the survivors. As the camera swings around, what you see is that it's actually a 2-shot of Cora and Hawkeye together, and Chingachgook is actually alone, separated out, truly the last of the Mohicans. And if you didn't get the message that these 2 belong together, the hairstyling in this film won an Oscar, because both of them have exactly the same hair, right? Hawkeye and Madeline Stowe both have this beautiful long black hair. They are meant to be together. They're a couple. Russell Means, Chingachgook is not meant to be here. So the lessons of the 19th century, in other words, what I'm saying, Cooper's lessons of the 19th century are retaught over and over and over again here in a contemporary film or moderately contemporary film. So let's turn to George Catlin. Concluding his first letter from the mouth of the Yellowstone in 1832, George Catlin explained his artistic mission with two breathlessly long sentences, outlining the ideology of Indian disappearance and his own solution to the problem. I have for many years past, he said, contemplated the noble races of red men who are now spread over these trackless forests and boundless prairies, melting away at the approach of civilization. That's the first sentence, and you can see the large space that's left, and this tells you, young writers, don't do what he is about to do. So I will not read this whole thing, but the general sense of it, right? Their rights, their morals, everything is corrupted. They're going to sink into the earth. The plowshare will turn the sod over their graves. But I, George Catlin, I will fly to their rescue. I'm not going to rescue their lives. I'm not going to save their race because, no, they are doomed to perish. But I will rescue their looks. Right? I will rescue the way they look, their modes. Right? Because everything else may throw all this awful stuff at them. And yet, phoenix-like, they will rise from the stain on the painter's palette, that is paint, right? And they will live again on canvas. And they will stand forth for centuries yet to come, the living monuments of a noble race. In other words, Indians will die, right? Paintings and representations will live and will become more lifelike than actual Indians. So this too, like the Cooper novel, right, is part of the legacy of the 19th century that continues on. Now for Catlin, vanishing Indians seem to sink constantly sink into the earth, plowed under by civilized farmers. Sinking and plowing are these kind of linked metaphors that structure many people's representations of Indian vanishing. White Americans like Catlin might regret the passing of Indians, but they were powerless to stop it. And yet, Catlin altered this rhetoric of disappearance in important ways. He criticized the acquisitive world of civilization. Right? He said civilization is a poisoning, trampling, crushing agent of destruction. So embedded in Catlin's thing is a critique of his own modernity, right, of civilization. And so before native disappearance came to pass, Indian people would have to bear the further indignity of cultural and social corruption. And this is going to point us to one of those other kinds of modes of thinking about savage and noble and distant and close. Contact with civilization changed them. It changed them for the worse because civilization had immoral elements often concentrated in the frontier, the contact zone of the frontier. This is a sign that I should stop and drink water. Don't you think? Yes. My, that's good. The water here in central Pennsylvania is mighty fine. So as they lost rights in the land, Catlin worried that Indians also would lose the morality that made them noble and the customs that demonstrated their cultural purity. So this curious double image, Wijunjun, the pigeon's egghead, offers a particularly fine example of his concerns about Indian corruption. A pure and noble Western Indian meets civilization in the form of Washington, D.C., and returns not an enlightened person, right, but a degraded wretch, alcohol bottles in his back pocket, smoking, carrying a fan, wearing a military uniform, all these kinds of things. So Catlin proposed to remedy this situation by painting pure Indians, collecting as many likenesses as he possibly could, and thus preserving vanishing Indians in representational form. In Catlin's vision, his paintings would sit side by side in the gallery, as they're shown here at the Renwick Gallery in Washington, D.C., each face representing not only its original, but also the countless Indians Catlin had been unable to paint. I actually saw this exhibit, and it was completely unnerving, actually, to see a full wall full of like head after head after head, portrait after portrait or portrait. My own emotional response to this makes me wonder how it would have been seen 170 years ago if it was as powerful and disorienting. But like Cooper's novel, this strategy too has carried forward into the present. Rewritten in the National Museum of the American Indians, Our Lives and Our People's galleries in Washington, D.C. I'm on the board of this museum. We're actually changing this exhibit up, and probably not a moment too soon for many reasons. So George Catlin matters to this story for several reasons. He was not the first, but he was the most prolific and the most visibly public of a series of artists who created these kinds of Indian portraiture collections. Such artists range from Charles Bird King, who beginning in the 1820s painted Indian delegations to Washington, D.C. for over 2 decades, to James Otto Lewis, whose Aboriginal portfolio offered the first art portfolio of American Indian reproductions for sale to the public, to Elbridge Ayer Burbank, who painted over 1,200 Indian portraits in the late 19th and early 20th century. This painting tradition then, recording of the vanishing Indian, was carried into photography, most notably in the works of Alexander Gardner, the great Civil War photographer, and other mid-century studio photographers who recorded Indian delegations to Washington. And of course, the iconic figure in this photographic tradition is Edward S. Curtis, whose nostalgic sepia-toned images continue to dominate the American cultural imaginary when it comes to Indians. Also just want to sort of show you this other guy. This is my great-great-grandfather, Sassuet or Francois Deloria, taken by Alexander Gardner when he visited Washington, D.C. If you've ever seen a picture, it's a pretty commonly used one that shows the Andrew Johnson White House. There's a whole set of Indians kind of lined up beneath the porch. And there's one guy who's wearing a headdress. That's the guy. That's him. He's there signing a treaty, which is, maybe not such a great thing. So I got to tell you something about this Curtis thing. Do you want to hear a little side bit on this Curtis thing? So this cool Navajo photographer who's doing these things where he's kind of reproducing Curtis's wet plate 10-inch plate technique for shooting portraits. And what he discovered is that human skin pigment actually is darkened under these things. So when you look at Curtis's images, you think how dark these faces are. So what he's done is this whole series of portraits of redheads with freckles. Right? And redheads with freckles, using this technique, actually come out looking extremely dark, right? Because of the way that this technique actually works with pigment. It's a really fascinating and wonderful, wonderful project. In any case, this practice of collecting Indian images to preserve the vanishing race has long been a defining impulse in the United States culture, one that, again, carries through to the present moment, right? But Catlin points us in other directions as well. Most particularly in the ways that he took this Indian gallery and he toured it in the United States and Great Britain. Now, while in London, as the audiences started to dwindle, how often can you come and see this? Not very, you see it once, right? Catlin conceived of the idea of posing Indian tableau. This was sort of a still life performance with real people in costume and regalia kind of posing, standing there kind of semi-frozen. And then later, exhibiting actual Indian people, usually dancing. And in this sense, we can see him as the forerunner of the Wild West show, to which I will return in a quick moment. Before going there, it's briefly worth noting, I think, two other genres that come down to us from the 19th century. And as with Catlin and Cooper, these were among the most popular representations of their day, so popular that they easily entered the national cultural imagination, where they lingered for decades in one case and over a century in another. The first genre is that of the stage play, and in particular this play, Metamora by John Augustus Stone. This is the one that lingered for decades. The play was the winner of a contest commissioned in 1829 by Edwin Forrest, who was one of the most important stage actors in the mid-19th century. And it was performed hundreds of thousands of times, altered, parodied, riffed on in minstrel shows, faded, revived, in the process becoming deeply embedded in the American cultural vocabulary. And its key moment, the thing that stands out from this, is the Indian death scene. Many people have written Indian death scenes, and they go something like this, as you see in the play. Metamora dies, and he has this long extended kind of thing where he's dying, and he says, I give my land to you, paleface, kind of thing, right? So this is kind of how the play works, right? It's sort of last Indian blessing, right, upon the people who will then move in and take over. Well, the second of these forms was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's 1855 epic poem, Song of Hiawatha, modeled on the Kaliva, the Finnish epic nationalist poem and song collection published in 1849. Now, back in the day, school kids memorized chunks of Hiawatha. It morphed into plays, paintings, toys, other literature, statues, railroad lines, butter, and everything else. Longfellow meant it to serve as an American expression of the indigenous roots of the nation, explicitly said this. And so it included both vanishing ideology and a sense of the American melting pot kind of moving westward. And it's worth just sort of pausing here and just sort of taking a quick look. You read this thing and you get the rhythm in your head, right? I think we should all read the final stanza together, don't you? We're going to start here. Then a darker, drearier vision passed before me, vague and cloud-like. I beheld our nation scatter, all forgetful of my counsels, weakened, warring with each other. Saw the remnants of our people sweeping westward, wild and woeful, like the cloud rack of a tempest, like the withered leaves of autumn. Right? Back to just a story again, right? The withered leaves of autumn, these Indians sort of fading. Thank you for reading that with me. In the late 19th century, as the final conquest of Indian people came within view and then was brought to fruition, easily marked by the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre, white Americans began to display an increasing ambivalence about closing the curtain on the era of the Indian Wars and vanishing Indians. So this revolutionary legacy of the Indian as American self, right, never went away. But now it was overlaid and complicated with a new sensibility, right? One that we saw just a hint of in George Catlin, one concerned with the scariness and oppressions of the modern world. Right? You know what this looks like, right? Too many people, too many machines, too far removed from nature, too little spiritual meaning, not enough community, too much city, too much inauthenticity, not enough vitality in one's life. These were the emotional contents of modernity, and it should come as no surprise to find that what? Images and ideas about Indians offered evocative responses to these anxieties. Now, one of the great anxieties took form around child rearing. With the supposed closing of the American frontier and the flood of new immigrants into the cities, the old experiences of becoming American while carving out a wild, primitive country and surviving Indian attacks, these things were no longer available. So how could you raise kind of hardy American kids in cities and suburbs? Well, duh, right? Be an Indian, said Arthur C. Parker, keep cool, right? If you're tired of work, no, don't work. Take the trail for the timber, because enjoy the outdoors like an uncontaminated redskin. Right? The boys love to play Indian. Even little girls dress up like Red Wings and mini ha-has. Red Wings and mini ha-has. It's nature to be Indian in this country, so the scientists say. The sooner imported immigrants understand this, the sooner the race will improve. Whoa, I mean, that last sentence is loaded down with all kinds of crazy stuff about race and migration and eugenics and all kinds of nutty things. And in fact, this frames a context for the next chapter here in this story.